Hi, and welcome to Is That Even Constitutional? This is a podcast where we use the lens of the Constitution to dissect current events. My name is Sadhana Devaraja, and I am not a constitutional scholar, but lucky for me, my good friend Ken Thomas is. Hi, Ken. How are you?
Good morning, Sadhana. How are you?
I am doing all right. So, as you know, this is our second season, which we are calling the Project 2026 series. And today we're going to go into the first proposal of an arc where we set forth 10 winnable proposals that would help us reclaim the Constitution through legislation. So today we're going to kick off by focusing on the right to majority rule and on ending the filibuster. And so this is a pretty kind of wonky topic, and Ken's going to help us understand it a little bit here. So Ken, to kick us off, what is the filibuster and why should we care?
So this filibuster is a Senate rule, and it is actually fairly simple. You can explain it fairly simply, or you can explain it in a very parliamentary way. But the simple answer is that you mostly need 60 votes by senators in order to move legislation to final passage, to move it to the final vote. And so that's the filibuster by itself. The reason this is important is that the opportunity to pass legislation has become very limited because of the filibuster. Now, the filibuster has changed over time. We could talk about that. But what has happened is that as the partisan majorities have gone to pretty much straight party line votes, we now have a situation where unless you literally have 60 people from one party in the Senate, then it's hard to get something passed. So the last time that we had that in the last 45 years was President Obama, and he had a filibuster-proof Senate. In other words, he had 60 senators who were Democrats for only about 72 days, and that was because Senator Ted Kennedy died, and his replacement, Scott Brown, was a Republican when the special election was held. And so that was really the very, very, short period of time where we've actually had a filibuster-proof majority. And in that time, President Obama and the Congress passed Obamacare. They passed banking reform. They passed relief legislation for the Great Recession that we were in the middle of. There was this huge amount of congressional activity that happened at literally light speed. I was actually on Capitol Hill, and we would see drafts of bill come in and go out in a way that we had never seen before. It was a lot of legislation passed in basically a very short time, and then it ended. And then since then, significant legislation is almost impossible to pass. And so the filibuster is probably one of the biggest reasons that you see disenchantment with Congress, is because it seems to be that Congress isn't doing anything.
And so just so we're clear, though, does the Senate always require 60 votes, or can they pass some things with less than 60 votes?
So that's a great question. As the filibuster itself has become more difficult to overcome, Congress has recognized that there are some things they just have to get passed. And so the biggest is called reconciliation. And reconciliation basically started as a deficit reduction reconciliation procedures in statute, but it provides how the Senate will proceed with a vote, and it includes timelines and things having to go to the vote. So under reconciliation, you can pass things that are relevant to revenue, either raising it or spending it. And so that's how we got, for instance, the Big Beautiful Bill Act, which is a great name because it's both a bill and an act at the same time somehow. But that's how we got that passed. And that was obviously a very, very significant piece of legislation, both in terms of changes to the tax code and changes to Medicaid. And that was done without 60 votes. So that's one example. And then there are a couple other very small examples that have been carved out, such as judicial nominations, Supreme Court nominations. So it's not that Congress has not noticed that the filibuster gets in the way, but they have really only cut around it in some very specific situations that seem important to get something done.
That's great. Thanks, Ken, for kind of showing some of the ways that we do have legislation passed in the Senate that doesn't require the 60 senators to pass it. How has the filibuster changed over time? I kind of remember hearing that, filibuster means you got to stand up and talk for a really long time, but we don't really see that these days. And so wondering, how has the filibuster changed?
Yeah, so you can go back and watch the classic Jimmy Stewart movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and that'll give you a sense of what the filibuster used to be. That film included a good senator and a bad senator, and the bad senator was trying to get rid of the good senator and throw him out. And so the good senator stands on the Senate floor and talks for 25 hours to basically stop his own expulsion. And what he's essentially trying to do is point out corruption in the Senate, and that's why they're trying to get rid of him. And he stands on the floor, upholds everything for 24 hours. The newspapers all cover it. All these letters come in, and basically he is vindicated in the end. And the bad senator, basically is caught out. That's not how it is anymore. What the problem with standing filibusters was that the other senators had to stick around. And the reason they had to stick around is because if they left, then the person who's filibustering could just say, oh, we have no quorum, we need to adjourn. And once it's adjourned, then the whole legislative process has to start over again. And so the senators had to stick around. So at one point, change was made. So it wasn't just one senator. Senators could tag team. So you could just kind of put up a rotating number of senators. And that meant that the other senators sometimes had to literally sleep on cots in their offices in order to break a filibuster. And apparently they didn't really like that. So they finally got to the point where they just said, okay, all you have to do, and this is literally all you have to do, is the leader of the party who is filibustering turns to the parliamentarian, basically just signals and just says we're going to filibuster, and that's it. Basically, it's over, and the other side just kind of goes away. And so what happens, of course, is that back in the standing filibuster, it would happen not that often. Over the course of 30 or 40 years, you might get 50 or 60 filibusters. But then once you made it so easy, the numbers just started increasing to the point where I think a couple of Congress ago, there was like 328 filibusters, meaning 328 pieces of legislation came up that probably had majority support, and they couldn't pass the Senate because of filibuster. So the filibuster is just so much different from what it used to be. And I think people know this, or at least they know the Congress is not doing anything. So there really isn't anything historical or traditional about the filibuster that we're looking at now. It's only a couple decades old. And so the idea that it's somehow sacrosanct, I think really needs to be debunked. It's relatively new, and it isn't really something that I think people are very happy with.
That's super interesting. I'd love to know what those like over 300 pieces of legislation were that we could have had if not for the filibuster. I feel like that would be really interesting. And on one hand, I can imagine why it's helpful to be able to kind of stop everything that's happening in Congress to focus on one issue. And on the other hand, that seems like that could be really harmful as well. And so it's interesting to kind of reflect on what the standing filibuster is and this new version that makes it maybe entirely too easy and kind of what middle ground, if anything, lives between them. And so is this kind of getting worse? What's kind of the problem with the filibuster?
Well, really, I think what has happened is that the filibuster has really pretty much just changed the whole nature of the Congress, and it has probably shifted the really huge focus of power to the executive branch. And to some extent, you have really seen this over the last 20, 30 years, where President Biden issued some executive orders that were probably beyond his authority. There's one in particular, student loan program. He did a lot of student loan forgiveness that was really probably not going to pass muster with the courts, and it didn't, because he really didn't have the power to do it. But the reason he did it is because there's just so little chance of getting anything through Congress that the executive branch and the president really seem to take the position that something has to be done and I can't just sit here. So I'd rather do something rather than nothing. And then, of course, with President Trump, we have, kind of an explosion of exactly that kind of thinking, which is that, well, everybody's waiting around for Congress. Congress hasn't done anything. Congress is doing less and less. I'm just going to go ahead and do it and let the courts deal with whether or not I'm allowed to do this or not. And so I actually think that you could trace the rise of the executive branch taking on powers that are not obviously allocated to them to the fact that Congress isn't doing it. And not only is Congress not doing it, but Congress is actually to some extent happy to hand it over to the executive branch and not have to deal with the difficulty of legislation and not have to deal with the political fallout, but rather they are probably just as happy to have their president be a little more aggressive. And I think that has been the result. But I don't think that's something that the American people were looking for, and I don't think it's something the founding fathers were looking for, and I really don't think it was anything anybody was looking for, except for I hate to say it, the senators who kind of wanted to get their sleep, which I understand. I like sleeping too, but at some point, democracy takes some sacrifice. And if it means sleeping on a cot, or if it means, kind of having to deal with some tough situations, then I think that's something that the American people want. That would be my
Yeah, and so
two.
to kind of underscore that point, because I think as you were describing the student loan forgiveness, one point of view is that, Congress isn't doing anything, so the executive will. And the second point that you got to is, well, is it actually part of like the political machinery to give congressional folks, to give senators in particular, cover to not take action on legislation? So is like not passing those over 300 bills part of how they're able to remain in power because they're not taking controversial stances with their electorate. Does that sound right? Does that sound like part
Yeah,
of
oh
the
no,
reason?
absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
it's an interesting question. There are political benefits to, especially in today's day and age, not to take controversial positions, not to have votes on controversial positions. And the interesting thing is that when you vote, you filibuster something, you're not really voting on final passage. And so it doesn't have the same resonance as saying, oh, you voted against this, or
Uh-huh.
you voted for this. So yeah, the filibuster provides covers, I think, to everybody in the party. And I should say, it is stunningly unique in the world. Industrialized democracies do not have supermajorities for simple legislation. Constitution has supermajority requirements. When I say supermajority, I mean more than half needed to vote for something. So the United States Constitution has supermajorities. They have it for impeachment. They have it for constitutional amendments. But the Constitution doesn't have a filibuster. It doesn't have a 60 vote. These are all Senate rules, and we do not see this in other democracies. Other democracies operate by majority rule, and every democracy, every parliament has their eccentricities, has their differences. I mean, nobody's exactly like us, but our adoption of a really very, very recent Senate rule that has changed the whole democracy that we live in, I think people don't see it in the context it should be seen, which is new. This is unusual, and this is a big change to our constitutional regime. There are groups and politicians who are definitely behind this and supporting this, and it's obscure because people don't really understand Senate parliamentary rule, but it's not obscure in terms of power and what people feel about how this would change things to either change or modify the filibuster.
Yeah, and so I want to pull up on one thing because you said, the filibuster isn't in the Constitution, right? So you named a few things that are in the Constitution that requires supermajorities, but does it mean that the filibuster is unconstitutional? Is it constitutional? Kind of what's the
That
response
is
there?
such a good question. And I'm going to say something that may be a surprise to people. There are a lot of constitutional questions that have never been asked. They may never have been asked because the issue never came up. They may never be asked because people couldn't get standing, meaning nobody could prove they'd been injured enough to actually sue. In this particular case, we don't know whether the filibuster is constitutional because the Supreme Court has a doctrine usually called political question or something similar where they will defer to another governmental body on certain things. So, for instance, the president has pardon power. Supreme Court will not review it. That is just basically a power allocated to the president. He makes that decision. So, for the Senate rules, that's pretty much what the Supreme Court has said, which is that those are your rules. Unless we see something deeply unconstitutional about it, like say it violated equal protection or something, you're on your own. You are the body who will decide the constitutionality on it. So if the filibuster ever came up, the Supreme Court would probably just say that is up to the Congress to decide. Congress has never addressed that question. They have not ever voted. And they could vote on this. You could make a constitutional challenge to the filibuster and get a vote on it, but it's never happened. Congress has not voted on whether or not the filibuster is constitutional or not. So is it constitutional or not? So probably the reason that it would arguably evade being unconstitutional is because it's not the final vote of the Senate. If you think about a bill goes into a committee, it gets voted on there, and then it comes out of committee, and then it goes through this procedure, and then the rules committee does something, and then there's a lot that happens before anything gets to a final vote. And the filibuster is basically one of those things. You're asking, the vote is on whether to bring the bill up for a vote or whether the bill moves forward. And so you're not voting on the bill, you're voting on whether you're going to vote on the bill. It's pre the
Uh-huh.
point where majority rule probably kicks in. So I could see an argument that it is not unconstitutional, but I'd also see the argument that it is certainly violates the spirit of majority rule and in function is absolutely acting as if it is changing the rules. And part of that reason, not only because of the ease of filibustering, is because we never used to have straight party line votes on every legislation. Both parties have now confirmed or firmed up their ideological, goals, and there really are not a lot of people in either party who would cross over or compromise, at least on kind of substantive legislation. And because of that, the one possible goal of the filibustering is compromise, is the idea that you have to deal with the minority and give the minority something, and then they'll go along and pass your legislation. That makes perfect sense until you see 328 pieces of legislation filibustered. That means that that compromise is gone. That is not happening. That reason for the filibuster is just not working, and it's not in the Constitution, and it's essentially, functionally violating majority rule. And so I just think that it is, to my mind, and recognize now, this is the first podcast that we're doing on this, our list of 10 changes. And the reason that I think the filibuster goes first is the filibuster changes everything. If you like climate change legislation, you don't like the filibuster. If you like, putting money back into Obamacare subsidies that are about to end, you don't want the filibuster. Obviously, I think sometimes people think the Constitution is going to solve our policy problems. That's not why the Constitution was created. The Constitution was created to give people the ability to deal with their policy problems. It's not supposed to fix them by themselves. And so the fact that the filibuster might lead to outcomes that you don't like just means that that's what the next election is about. And this is how democracy works. And sometimes I think our citizens can be a little like the cover of filibuster, because you can keep having opinions, but nobody ever actually passes anything. And so you can keep having those opinions. And it's not till things pass that you suddenly have to go, oh, gee, was that a good idea or not? So
Yeah.
it's a little risky. That's the response I get from everybody, which is I don't want to take the risk. And that is probably a good sign, in that Americans still somehow, despite what seems to be this very tumultuous time, are still risk adverse. They still think
Yeah.
that we shouldn't swing for the fences. We should just keep it simple. And I think that maybe citizens have to step up and start dealing with the consequences of majority.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think the last question I'll ask here, it's kind of a combo question, is about, if the filibuster has been harmful in these ways or encumbering us in these ways, are there alternatives, or can the filibuster be modified? Kind of what are our paths forward here? Is it that we have to end it? Is there a modification, or is there an alternative?
That's such a good question, and I struggle with that. The reconciliation, nominations, those are just straight majority rule. And so obviously in some cases, the choice has been made to just get rid of the filibuster. There are certainly politicians who are suggesting an intermediate step, which is standing filibusters, change the rules back to, you actually have to be on the floor talking to stop the legislation. And that is certainly an option. I mean, I guess one thing that I will freely admit here is that it would be nice if there was a simple answer to that, because then we could just kind of go for a up or a down vote. But there are probably good reasons to consider either eliminating the filibuster completely, eliminating the filibuster in particular circumstances, or reverting to the standing filibuster. So I'd love to be in a room with somebody to talk about legislative options on that, but I think there are many of them. And I think that there really is a way forward that has to change what's going on right now. Because at this point, I just feel like, we are in a situation that was likely caused by the filibuster and might not be ended by getting rid of the filibuster, but it will certainly move power back to Congress. Congress is a more responsive institution in general than the executive branch. The executive branch really one election every 4 years. Congress is a much different animal, and they do have to be a little more attentive to their constituents.
Thanks, Ken. So, what I'm taking away from our conversation is that, what we see in the modern filibuster wasn't enshrined in the Constitution. It's unclear whether it's constitutional or not. It sounds like there's arguments either way, and really isn't working for us. So it ends up being somewhat of a crutch for senators to not put their vote out publicly, maybe even for the electorate to not have to own up to ideas that we have about what would be the solution to our problems. It also ends up being a bit of a crutch to not compromise, it sounds like, right? Like from the historical assessment you gave us of how there used to be more compromise on legislation, and now it's straight party votes. And part of that feels related to this. And if we actually want to see change on important issues like climate change, we need to be able to end the filibuster. Or, as you kind of like landed with, there might be other alternatives. Maybe ending the filibuster might be modifying it. There might be other legislative solutions that take its place. There could be multiple paths forward. So thanks so much, Ken. Thanks for sharing about the filibuster and why we're proposing to end the modern filibuster. As you mentioned, we're starting here because the other 9 kind of depend on this premisarily. So we know this was a bit of a wonky topic, but we're so glad you all joined us today to listen in and come along. Please, if you're enjoying the content, like, subscribe, wherever you're getting your podcasts. Feel free to get in touch with us, give us your feedback, feel free to leave comments, and if you want to email us, please reach out at production@constitutionpod.com. Production@constitutionpod.com. Thanks, folks. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.